we've got them.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, Matt, something just happened.
Yeah?
Hold on.
Weird. Okay.
Mm.
Okay. But it's not now. Can you say
Yeah.
Could you go on?
I don't know if you found that with you.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I've got my glasses on and on.
You guys, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, excellent.
Hi, it's Beth Comstock. We're here for the Changemakers Book Club. I'm so excited to have Susan David.
Thank you.
And we're going to dig into emotional agility. I want to sort of set the stage.
Absolutely.
One of the things we've done right up front is we ask you to vote up questions. One of the best questions you voted up, we're going to feature it right up front and ask you to start to answer it in the comments section, and we're going to give away some books as a way to go throughout the session. So the question is a really good one. Basically, to ask, how do you love your imperfections? I think it's such a good question, isn't it? It just really made me think.
Yes. So people are thinking about how do you love your imperfections, because I think that's so critical.
It's
difficult to move through the world effectively unless we feel comfortable within ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So Susan is a psychologist and author now of Emotional Agility, and you were saying it's just pasted in a great new way on the Amazon ebooks.
Yes.
Is that right? So
yes, it's number 4 at the moment.
Congratulations.
On all books, so that's great. I'm excited.
So I'm going to tell you why we started doing this. I see in my daily work, the people I work with at GE, customers, partners, the world I interact with, everybody's struggling with change. The pace of change, you're probably seeing this in the people you interact with. And so one thing was, how do we get together? How do we use books as our reason to talk about this? And what I found over the past couple of book clubs we've had is people keep coming back to this same question of, how do I get my mindset ready? How do I deal with the emotions of change? Don't give me just the tools, but help me be emotionally ready. And so then when we happened to be introduced and come to know of your book, it was like, this is so perfect. And what I love about your book is it's very broad. I mean, you create a framework. It's not just one thing.
Yes.
And I think that's so helpful. So let's just start. I mean, give us a sense of, first of all, what is emotional agility in your mind? How do you describe it?
Absolutely. And I think what you start with is so critical. So, really the question that I was asking myself when I was writing this book is, as an emotions researcher and as someone who works in organizations as a psychologist, is this key question: what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and the stories that we tell ourselves? I'm not good enough, or I'm not cut out for this job, or my boss is crazy. What does it take? No. What does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories that ultimately help us to thrive in the world? And in a world that, as you speak about, is a world that is ever-changing, a world that is imperfect, and a world that is fragile. So what are the internal skills that we need in order to thrive in the reality of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be? So to come to your question then, what is emotional agility? The very caption definition of it, and I talk about this a lot, obviously, in the book, is that emotional agility is the ability to be with our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories in ways that are compassionate, because this is critical, in ways that are courageous, and in ways that are curious, because that allows us to learn. And then to make choices that are aligned with our true values and our intentions in the world.
Well, you talk so eloquently about that. It's hard to do.
Just
hearing you say that, I think most people are always surprised. You consult and coach, CEOs of companies, heads of organizations, and I think people would be surprised that these people also fight those voices. And just because you're the head of an organization doesn't mean you figured it out, right?
Well, this is one of the core things, is I think that we live in a narrative where effectively we see perfection on social media, where so much of what we hear in society is that we've just got to be positive, we've just got to be happy. And so what starts to happen, and this is something that I explore a lot in the book, is that we start to lose our ability to navigate our own inner world effectively. What do I trust? What don't I trust? So we start to do this thing where we may experience difficulty. I'm sad because my idea was stolen at work, or I'm angry because I feel like I've been passed over for a promotion, or even I'm disappointed that this relationship with someone that I love isn't working out. And yet often what we do is, instead of using those difficult emotions as beacons to be able to make change in our lives, rather what we do is we say, well, at least I've got a job, let me just forge forward. Yeah. And so a core part of emotional agility, which relates to what you were saying earlier, is that these difficult emotions, these difficult thoughts are actually normal. So the fact that a CEO might experience them, or that a senior executive might experience them, this is our body's way, that our emotions have evolved to help us as a species to survive. So while on the one hand we might say, well, I've got a bad thought, it's a negative thought, I shouldn't have it, in actual fact that's your brain doing the work that your brain was designed to do, which is to protect you.
Yeah.
So these,
such an interesting
perspective. Really, one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility is how difficult thoughts, emotions, and experiences are normal. We live in a world that makes them seem like they are abnormal, but actually they're normal.
So you're advocating to bring your emotional self to work. Work is a hard place for people to feel comfortable, just in general, but especially comfortable being vulnerable with their emotions. How do you advise people to take those steps?
So what I'm suggesting in emotional agility is that we don't get a choice as to whether we bring our emotions to work or not. We know, for example, and this is a very simple example, that if you've got a team leader who says, I'm dealing with really difficult change, but I'm just not going to say anything. I'm really angry with my team, but I'm just not going to say anything, because we've got this project and we've got to focus on the project. So that team leader is experiencing difficulty, is doing what I call bottling emotions, pushing those emotions aside. They might be doing that with the best of intentions. I've got this project, I need to be goal focused, and I need to just be positive. But what we know is that when you push emotions aside, there is what we call in psychology amplification. All of us will have experienced this. You don't want to eat chocolate cake because you're trying to be healthy.
Want to eat chocolate cake.
Or you try not to think about it, and what do? You dream about it. So what we know with amplification is the very things that you try to push out of your mind. I'm just not going to say something to the team, or I'm going to ignore the fact that I'm angry with my brother-in-law. What happens is it comes out in a snide remark. It comes out. We know in psychology there's this amplification effect. We also know that the thoughts that you try to push aside, in about 1 minute, if you try not to think about something, you will think about that thing 40 times.
Oh my goodness.
So pushing our emotions away doesn't work.
We're fooling ourselves.
We're fooling ourselves. We need, in order to be effective, to develop strategies to be able to open our hearts to the emotion. This is how I'm feeling. To be able to learn from that and to be able to move forward effectively.
So we're with Susan David. The book
Hi,
is
everyone.
Emotional Agility, which is really fantastic and a great way to get into the mindset of what we have to do to change. We're giving away books. We've got a question we'd like you to answer, which will, I think, be good stimulus about really being kind to yourself. And we're going to continue, and we're going to take your questions. So please be sure to give us your questions as you go forward. In fact, we in advance had some questions from some folks, and we had some really good ones. So I think I want to start off with some of the ones that came in advance. Of course, I have 800 sheets of paper here. Hang on one second.
Beth is very conscientious.
I'm
very
clearly
organized,
conscientious. But clearly, I wasn't that organized today. All right. Let's see here where my questions went to. Okay, here's a great one. This is from Tracy Beauvais Diaz, And Tracy has a couple of questions. One, she says she loves the sound of the book. Tracy
Thank you,
says,
Tracy.
are there generational differences in the adoption of change? I mean, obviously in the workplace, we've got different people at different stages of experience, different stages of their life. Do you find the ability to navigate change different based on generation?
So there are some generational differences, and a lot of those differences land up being differences in cohort. So, for example, what I mean by this is if you have grown up in a society, for example, where you went through a war, there is a good chance, and I'll describe a little bit of my background, which is I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And while I was a white South African and therefore not subject to the same chaos and cruelty as so many of my fellow South Africans, it was nonetheless a time of great chaos. And so from a very early age, I became interested in these questions. How do we thrive in these complex environments? Now, what we know is that if you grow up in an environment where there is complexity, where there's this stuff going around all the time, you're more likely to be thinking about it, processing it, trying to find your way through it. So that's an example of where you might see a difference based on demographics or based on cohort. Another thing that we know in emotions that can land up being these differences is that often in, for example, families or even in gender, we have what we call display rules. So, for example, if you grow up in a family where it's been said to you, we only do happiness here, you know, not explicitly but implicitly, go to your room and come out when you've got a smile on your face, we don't do anger. What starts to happen is you may grow up not feeling comfortable with emotions other than happiness. So when you feel conflicted at work, when you feel stressed, when people are asking too much of you, you may be struggling to set boundaries, to limit set, and so on. So the answer is yes, we find differences in generation, but we also find differences based on the environment that each of us have grown up in that's so unique.
So what's interesting, I thought in your book, you talked about the power of positive thinking, and you actually bring a unique point to it. I mean, you're not such a fan of positive thinking.
So don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-happiness. I'm a very happy person.
You are a very happy person.
I'm a very happy person. In fact, I wrote a book at one stage, which is an 80-chapter book called The Oxford Handbook of Happiness, which is literally the end-to-end, what do we know about human happiness?
Oh my goodness.
So I'm not anti-happiness, but what is my concern about this positive thinking movement and this focus on happy, happy, happy? There are a couple of things that relate to that. The first is that we, as I mentioned earlier, live in a world that is imperfect. And so what starts to happen is when people focus on happiness as a goal, I just want to be happier, I just want to be happier. There's this beautiful saying that expectations are disappointments waiting to happen. And when we set expectations about our own level of happiness, what starts to happen over time is we know from the research those individuals actually become less happy. So it's almost like...
so interesting.
And why is this?
Yeah, why is
so
that?
why is this? So one of the
There's
things
the
that...
whole fake it until you make it kind of thinking.
So what I think happens, and what I talk about in emotional agility, is that our difficult emotions are often signposts to the things that we most care about. So as an example, if I'm feeling guilty because I'm traveling a lot and I'm away from my children, that guilt, while I might be saying, well, I'm feeling guilty, let me just be positive and let me just be happy, that guilt is a signal to me of, Susan, being a present, connected parent is something that is important to you. If your idea has been stolen at work and you are angry about it, what that is signaling is that you have a value around equity and fairness. So what I think happens when we just push our difficult emotions aside is we fail to face into the learning that can come from those difficult emotions, the learning about what is important to us, that then ultimately helps us to navigate the world
So
effectively.
I hear a lot of self-discovery in what you're talking about. So people have to be stop and ask themselves, why am I feeling this way? What is important to me at this moment?
Yes, and often in very practical ways. You know, we think about change. So often when people are going through change, and we see this in organizations, everyone says, oh, I'm just so stressed. I'm so stressed. I'm so stressed. I'm so stressed. I'm so busy. I'm so busy. I'm so busy. I'm so busy.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that is a very normal thing. Everyone does it. But there is a world of difference between I'm stressed versus I'm disappointed. I'm stressed versus I'm anxious. I'm stressed versus I thought that my career would be so different and my contribution so different than it is, and I'm really sad about a loss of time. Now, if I was working with an executive coaching client who said to me, I'm just stressed, I'm stressed, if I just took that at face value, I would say, let's learn how to delegate more.
Yeah.
But if what's really going on is, I think I might be in the wrong career, then tips about delegation don't cut
not going
it.
to really help.
So what's really interesting is even doing something as simple as what we call emotion differentiation. So saying to yourself, well, the first emotion is stress, but what are two other options here? Disappointment, sadness. We know that people who are more fine-tuned about the label that they use for their emotional experience tend to be happier over time. So they're facing in to their emotions. They're not pretending in the service of happiness, but they actually end up being happier over time. They have high levels of well-being over time. And what's really interesting is when you label your emotions more effectively, it activates your readiness potential. It activates your ability to set goals. It activates your ability to make real concrete changes.
So we have some more questions.
Go for
Again, we're talking to Susan David. This
Hi,
is
everyone.
about emotional agility. Susan Safia Stofel Nadim asks, how do you bring emotions into the workplace while avoiding oversharing with your colleagues? So you want to express yourself, but you don't want your colleagues to, you don't want to become a burden for your colleagues, or
Yes.
you don't want them to think you're weird.
Yeah. So just to be clear, when I'm talking about bringing emotions to the workplace, I'm not talking about bringing your emotions to the workplace is not the same as wearing your heart on a sleeve, telling people how you feel all the time. What I'm really talking about is being connected with your inner heartbeat, your inner why, what is going on for you, labeling your emotions effectively, asking yourself how your emotions are serving you or not. Because so often what we do in the workplace is we get very stuck in our emotions. So I'll give you an example. I talk in the book about being hooked.
Yeah. It's gonna
So
ask you
this
to go
idea
through
of
that.
being
Yeah.
hooked, okay? So, and I'll get to this question now because it's a really important question. So I talk about this idea of being hooked. What I mean by being hooked is when we have a thought, I'm not good enough, my boss is an idiot. We have an emotion, fear, I'm so stressed. Or we have a story, I would love to put my hand up for that job or for that role, but I'm just not good enough. And so we have these thoughts, the emotions, these stories that are normal. Okay, they're normal as we mentioned earlier. But what hooked is when you crawl into a thought, emotion, a story, and allow that to drive your actions in ways that are often values incongruent and misaligned with who you truly want to be. So for example, I'm not being heard, or my boss is an idiot, so I'm just going to shut up. Or personally, my partner's starting in on the finances, so I'm just going to walk out the room. So what happens is you land up having this lack of space between your thought and emotion and your action.
Mm-hmm. So give yourself some space.
Giving yourself some space. There's this
Is
beautiful...
it like saying I'm going to sleep on it and you go home and think about
Well,
it? And then do you say I'll get back to you? What's a good tactic?
Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi death camps, had this beautiful, beautiful attributed idea, which is this. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And it's in that choice that comes our growth and freedom. So you sitting in that meeting and you saying to yourself, I'm so upset, I'm just going to keep quiet. Or there's no point in talking in these meetings anymore, so I'm going to keep quiet. Yet if you asked yourself, who is it that I want to be in the world? What you might be finding is that who you want to be is a contributor. Who you want to be is a collaborator. Who you want to be is a team player. But when you are sitting in that meeting, shutting down, you are hooked. Your thoughts, your emotions are driving your actions rather than your values.
So a hook is something, it's a way we've always behaved. It's basically keeping us from being the person we can be. Is that
Our
what you're
hooks
saying?
stop us from being the person who we most want to be. So I'm sitting in this meeting and I'm saying, I'm just going to keep quiet, and you hooked. So how do we start to unhook? Okay. So in emotional agility, I describe 4 very distinct and very important aspects to this. Absolutely. So the first is what I call showing up. This idea that we spoke about earlier, which is recognizing that we don't need to struggle with whether our emotions are good or bad. They just are.
I really want to take a pause for a moment,
important.
because I thought that was really good. I mean, you think showing up, it's like just show up, and it's just being there is half the battle. You're saying no, allowing yourself that space.
I'm saying show up to yourself. Show up to yourself. There's this beautiful phrase in South Africa, actually. Zulu people, when they're saying hello to one another, say sawubona, sawubona. And sawubona quite literally means I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. It's beautiful. We all want to be seen. We want to be seen by our partners, by our bosses, but we also want to be seen by ourselves. And so often what we do in the workplace is we get onto autopilot. We come to work, we go home, we react, we act. But we don't often stop to think about, am I acting in ways that are serving me, that are values aligned?
So showing up is that.
So showing up is that. Showing up is the ability to stop struggling with whether something is good or bad. It just is, to recognize that in yourself.
So hang that
is
thought.
the first thing.
And so first thing is showing up, and one of the questions we're asking is, how can I love my imperfections? So that's a way of just accepting that there are imperfections. Is that an example?
So showing up is, it's recognizing that all of us, every single person watching, every one of us is doing the best we can with who we are, with what we've got, and with where we find ourselves in the world.
Okay, so that's the first thing.
Every
Show
person
up,
showing
doing the
up
best you can
in
with what you have.
compassion.
Okay.
Compassion with yourself. The second part of emotional agility is, and coming back to my person in the meeting, is being able to step out of your emotions. So what I mean here is, who's in charge? The thinker or the thought? Is your emotion in charge? Is your thought in charge?
Well, at that moment, your emotion is
So
really
when you're
in charge.
hooked,
Yeah.
your emotions and thoughts are driving you. Stepping out is the ability to start creating space that allows you, in the fullness of who you are, to be in charge. So they're very simple ways that we can start doing this in the meeting.
Okay, so you're showing up,
Okay,
then you're
so
stepping
you're
out.
sitting in this meeting, and instead of just saying, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, being able to say, what is really going on for me here? I'm feeling disappointed, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling undermined. So it's really important. A second very practical strategy is noticing your thoughts and feelings for what they are. They are thoughts and feelings. They are not who you are. They are data, not directions.
So I'm going to stop you there for a second,
So-
because some of the questions we're getting.
Okay.
Allison Cohen's asking, saying, like, this is a great discussion. I appreciate it, but the world's so fast moving. We're changing so much, Susan. Like, how do you have time to do what you're saying?
So-
how do I have time to show up and step out?
So when you are sitting in that meeting and you're saying to yourself, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed.
Well, we all have so many deadlines. We have
I'm
so
stressed.
many things. How
Okay.
do we deal
So
with that?
it is really critical that we notice our thoughts and feelings for what they are. So you're sitting in the meeting saying, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. If you see what you're doing to yourself when you say, I am stressed, you are identifying 100% of yourself with stress. If you make one tweak to that, I'm noticing the feeling of being stressed. I'm noticing the thought that my boss is undermining me. All you're doing here is you are creating space where you're saying, instead of I am stressed, I'm noticing that I'm having this feeling that I'm stressed. So that's one example. Another thing that I talk about in emotional agility, which is also just critical, which is the third aspect, is what I call walking your why. And walking your why is, to the question that's just come up, fundamental. We all go through life in such a busy way, in such a frantic way, that we often stop paying attention to our own inner why. Who do we want to be in the world? So, so fascinating. Imagine, for example, you are trying to be healthy.
Yeah.
You're trying to lose weight. Now, you get on an aeroplane and you are sitting next to a seatmate and you don't even know your seatmate, but your seatmate buys candy on the aeroplane. Your chance of buying candy increases by 30%. So what you are starting to see here is the phenomenon of what we call social contagion, where we pick up someone else is buying candy, we're going to buy candy. We're in an elevator, people are looking at their phones, we look at our phones. Everyone else is moaning about what's going on at work and the change. We start moaning about what's going on at work and the change. And so what starts to happen is we start to be impacted by everyone in our environment. So what protects us from that? What helps us? So a critical aspect of this is having a sense of, who do I want to be? Like, what kind of leader do I want to be?
Is it that Gandhi quote, be the change you want to be? So in a changing world, to be able to model the kind of behavior that you want to be a part of?
To be able to model it, but before we can model it, we need to tap into, who do I want to be? I'll give you an example, which is a very practical example. I was working with a client who was going through massive change in the workplace. And the organization that I was consulting with could have done this differently. But this is effectively what happened, is they were going through this change, 180,000 people, and they had targeted this particular woman for a life-changing promotion. She was going to be promoted to one of the top 10 individuals in the organization. But they decided, in their wisdom, which wasn't, that they were not going to tell her, because there were all these other things that they needed to put in place, and they felt that if they told her that it was going to open up a can of worms and people were going to ask questions, and so they decided they were not going to tell her. I went off on maternity leave, and I came back to find that this woman, who had been targeted for a life-changing promotion, had been fired.
Oh no, what happened?
Okay. So I had coffee with her and I said to her, what happened? What happened? And she said to me, well, people started to react differently to me. When I was walking down the passageways, there would be conversations that would start or stop. And in my mind, I persuaded myself that I was about to be fired. Now, in fact, she was not about to be fired. She was about to be promoted. But what she did is she became hooked. What's critical to the story is that if you had to say to her, what is your core value? Who do you most want to be as a leader? What she would have said is, I want to be a contributor. To contribute is my most important thing that I want to bring to the world. But when she was hooked, she stopped doing that.
Yeah.
Now, you could say, well, the company was wrong, they were wrong, they were wrong. One of the things that I think is really important, and for all of us going through change, is this. We so often get hooked onto being right. Okay, so my manager is wrong and I am right. My company is doing this thing in this particular way and they are wrong and I am right. And so often this focus on being right creates wars. It creates breakdowns in families we've all had the experience of, you have a fight with your spouse or your partner, and finally calm descends and you go to sleep. But as you turn out the light, something compels you to say one last time why you are right and they are wrong, and then chaos breaks loose again. We become so focused on being right. And so one of the questions that I always ask people is, if the gods of right came down and said, you are right, your boss is an idiot, your team member is not pulling their weight, the company is messing up, even if everyone agreed with you that you are right, you still get to choose how you want to act in that circumstance.
You had a couple in that section of the book where you talked about people needing to be right. I'm going to read. You had a couple.
Go for it.
You had a couple of other pieces where we talked about how dealing with your colleagues and how people deal with it. Sometimes you talk about the focus and speed that people just are very rigid, so they stay very rigid. You talked about premature decision making, simplistic solutions. You had this great quote. You said, "Smart people acting dumb."
Yes.
You had another example of that you see when you're coaching, that people go to the checklist. I see that a lot. The reaction is either let me just get down to the basics. Let's get back to our checklist. So there are a lot of ways people kind of obfuscate, if you will, dealing with the reality of what needs to change.
Yeah. Yes. And so we live in such a complex, fast-paced world, and so often what we do is we use what we call our quick intuitive response. It's the checklist. It's the easy answer. And that can be really helpful, except when it's not.
Yeah.
Except when it's taking you away from being the leader you want to be. Except when it's keeping you moaning at the water cooler rather than moving things in a direction that might be more helpful to you. So acting in this very quick way is helpful. We would not survive if we thought through everything, if we try to slow down everything. But there are critical times when we do need to slow down.
So you're sort of saying slow down to go fast.
What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What do I need to do here? Who do I need to be?
So another question, this is from, take a question here from Ming Zhang, who says, you talk about, in the book you talk about stepping out and looking at the entire chessboard. How do we get there? How do we give ourselves that sort of meta view when you're in the middle of things, when you're sort of focused on your checklist? How do you pull yourself back up?
So when you're focused on your checklist, what's often happening in that space is you've got this one-dimensional view of what you want to be here. And I see this so often with, again, talking about stress, is often when people are feeling stressed, they'll say things like, I'm so stressed, I've just got to get on with it. I'm so stressed, I've just got to get on with it. And they fail to pull back and say, who can help me here? What could I be doing differently? And so again, this idea of I've just got to be so focused on the outcome, and overvaluing the outcome is what gets us into the mess to begin with. I think that as employees, as individuals, as people, we can start navigating this quickness of change. We can start developing this stepping out if, for example, you become more connected with, gee, I'm not stressed, I am angry.
Yeah.
So you notice that emotion in yourself. If you come to the place where you are more focused on, right, I'm focusing on my checklist all the time, and I'm going into this meeting with my checklist of what I want to get through in the meeting, but what is my objective here? So often we go into a meeting.
Know what your why is.
Yeah.
In some ways, right?
So often we go into meetings with our checklist,
as opposed to saying, what am I trying to
what am
accomplish?
I really trying to achieve here? So I go through in the book very practical ways of thinking about, how can we think about what our why is? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And also very specifically, how we can deal with the reality of our emotions as they are, not as we wish them to be.
So I'm with Susan David. We're
Hi,
talking
everyone.
about emotional agility. Let's shift gears a little bit here. Can you walk us through, how have you dealt with transition and change in your life? how have you, and maybe talk about your career.
Yeah,
How did you make
yes,
choices? And also I'll
yes.
tie it in because one of the questions that came in from Lindsay Morris is, how do you have advice for making transitions in career paths? So talk about yours and maybe inform Lindsay.
Where to start? Well, I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier that I grew up in apartheid South Africa, but one of the most pivotal experiences that I had in my career was actually before my career even started, as is often the case. And that was that when I was 16 years old, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I experienced firsthand what so many of us experience in the day-to-day world, what a friend of mine described as the tyranny of positivity. She said to me, you know, if it was just a case of being positive, the friends in my stage 4 breast cancer support group would be alive today.
Yeah.
Because they were the most positive people that I know. And keeping on getting this messaging of I've just got to be positive, makes me feel culpable in my own death, that somehow I wasn't positive enough to think my way out of it. So back to my experience, my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I had so many people coming to me and saying, just be positive, everything will be fine, everything's going to be okay. But it wasn't okay.
Yeah. So you had to really face into
father
that.
was dying and
Yeah.
then dead. And I had this remarkable English teacher who engaged me in what became a secret silent correspondence. She invited us to keep journals. And every day I would write in this journal about what I was going through, the pain that I was facing, and I would hand it into her, and then she would respond with notes and thoughts and poems and comments. Now, Beth, what I realized afterwards was it was not the ignoring, just grit through it, everything will be fine, that helped me. What enabled me to move through that transition, and this is a particular type of transition, but career transitions, relationship transitions, what helped me through that transition was facing into my emotions, labeling my emotions. I wrote an article recently on the science of journaling, how incredibly helpful it is if you're going through change at work, a job loss, a relationship change. The
So
science
journaling,
of
how do we do
journaling.
that? Just writing
Like
down how we're
20
feeling?
minutes a day. Research has shown clearly that 20 minutes a day for 3 days,
Just writing how I feel?
just writing what is
so
going
it
on
doesn't
for
matter if
me.
you write bad, just...
You just write that 6 months later, if you take, for example, people who are going through job loss, 6 months later, people who are going through a job loss, who write about those difficult experiences, 20 minutes a day for 3 days, 6 months later, are significantly more likely to have been rehired. But more than that, they have high levels of psychological health, high levels of well-being, and greater levels of goal attainment in other areas of their lives. So I just want to come back to this question of transition, because this is the transition that I experienced. But then what other transitions did I have? I went to university and dropped out of university. I backpacked around the world for 2 years.
Did you have it in the back of your mind that you wanted to be a psychologist? Was that always back there?
So what happened was I had this experience with this teacher, and what this started to do was to really create this like gnawing question in my mind. So if this be positive and just ignore it doesn't help, but this experience that I've had did help, what is it that ultimately enables people to be effective not only at work, but in relationships and in their parenting and in their lives? So I was interested in psychology, but went to university, dropped out of university, backpacked around the world, and then started my career actually training people in shorthand secretarial skills. Like that was my, besides waitressing and so on. So I think, so often what happens is when we get stuck in the difficulty of what we're facing in our lives at the moment, it can feel so consuming.
So what advice would you have for Lindsay about how do you think about transitioning?
So the advice that I would have is a couple of fold. I would ask Lindsay a couple of questions. firstly, are you focusing on, and some of these will connect with Lindsay and some won't, but for all of our listeners, are there any goals in your life that are what I call dead people's goals? And what I mean by a dead person's goal is, are you in a situation where you're saying, I don't want to be stressed, I don't want to be rejected, I want to apply for this job, but I'm not going to because I may fail? If you're starting to have things like, I don't want to be hurt, I don't want to be sad, I don't want to be rejected, I don't want to fail, you are setting a dead person's goal. Because dead people never fail, dead people never get stressed. We don't want dead people to be our role model. So that is the first question I'd ask. Are we engaging in dead people's goals? The other thing, the other thing that I would ask is, are you in situations where you are choosing comfort rather than courage?
That's such a good one. So comfort rather than courage.
Are you in a situation where you're choosing comfort rather than courage?
Do you think you know that if you're in that situation?
I think a lot of people do. You know, what's really interesting is we get into patterns of being hooked, where we have the same argument time and time again, we apply for the same job time and time again, we leave the same job time and time again. And so we often choose to be, because our brain is wired in this way, there's nothing wrong with it, it's normal, but we often choose to be in situations of comfort rather than courage.
This is a trick I use for myself. I love feeling uncomfortable. I've had to feel good about that.
Yes.
And when I'm in those situations where I feel uncomfortable, I push myself just 10% more. Just push myself out there. You know, it's so easy to get into it, and so I've kind of gotten into a pattern of just push myself just a little bit more.
It's so important. And what you describe in the book, I talk about this idea of when you overcompetent, when you in your job, you could do your job with your eyes closed, or you go out to a meal and you know exactly what the discussion's going to be over that meal. You overcompetent in that area of your life. When you're overcompetent, you are losing your capability to grow and learn.
Yeah, that talks about it, sort of a growth mindset that you talk about in the book. I mean, is there something that people can be doing to have more of a growth mindset, to be more uncomfortable?
So recognize when you're overcompetent. But we also don't want to be in situations where we are over-challenged, where you're constantly in the deep end. So we always want to be looking for working at the edge of our ability and actively recognizing this very, very important thing, which is that in the world, people will tell us, conquer your fear, do away with your fear, get rid of your fear. Our fear helps us. It is a gift.
So go into your fear.
We cannot get rid of our fear. So instead, recognize this, that courage is not an absence of fear. Courage is fear walking. Courage is about noticing your fear, noticing what's holding you back with compassion, with curiosity, and then choosing to take actions that are values concordant.
We have a few minutes left. Can you talk about job crafting? I thought that was such a great example of being able to sort of take control, or to realize that you have control in some decisions. Talk about what job crafting is.
It's so critical.
It's the thinking here too.
Absolutely, it's a really critical idea. Often when we're trying to make change in our lives, or when we're trying to deal with circumstances of change, we often become very big about the change we want to make. So I've just got to give it all up and go live on a deserted island somewhere.
I'll admit to it.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But we get so much leverage in our lives by doing what I call making tiny tweaks. So finding areas of your life where you can make small, values-aligned changes. So I have been consistently not putting my hand up for something that actually would be meaningful to me in my career. So that is a tiny tweak that I want to make. And job crafting is exactly this idea that often we may not, because of the circumstances, because of financial constraints, because of the reality, be able to go and live on that Greek island. It is a Greek island for me. But we don't necessarily need to be in a circumstance where we become so hooked on feeling like a victim that we struggle to move forward effectively in our lives. So if we can start looking for want-to goals, things that are values aligned, small changes that we can make to the conversations we're having at work, the people we're interacting with.
So you see some things you want to do, and instead of saying, oh, my boss will never let me do that part of my job, start to take a few small steps and say, let me start doing some of this.
Let me start doing some of this. Yeah, I love actually when conversations about marketing come up. And even though marketing isn't my role, isn't my career, I love it when these conversations come up. Is there a way that my manager would let me in on the marketing related conversations where I can provide my perspective?
Yeah.
So what are small but meaningful ways that we can look at either who I'm interacting with at work, what I am doing at work, or the situations that I'm navigating myself towards or avoiding, that ultimately I can make small changes to that will allow me to thrive and to feel more fulfilled in what I'm doing.
So I think we'll take one last question. This is from...
We are getting so many.
We're getting a lot. Andrew Muller asked... Andrew says, often our emotional health is influenced by others.
Yes.
And with text and digital taking so much of our role in our communications, we're maybe perhaps starting to lose social and emotional cues. And he asks, how do we make up for this? Have you thought about this? I mean, how do we, in a social digital age, make ourselves more emotionally aware?
So I think there are a couple of aspects to this. The first, and Andrew, I mean, this is a striking statistic, and not to get all Debbie Downer, but by 2030, the World Health Organization predicts that depression, not heart disease, not diabetes, not cancer, depression will be the single leading cause of disability globally. Now, what that means for organizations, what that means for society is unprecedented. I don't believe that organizations are even thinking through these kinds of issues. So depression will be the leading cause of disability globally. And I think that, Andrew's point here is we are so surrounded. So how do we protect ourselves? The first is recognizing the power of social contagion. Recognizing that when you are on Facebook, and we know studies show this, we are on Facebook, we love Facebook, but we know that people's moods change in a contagious way once they've been on Facebook. So we know, for example, Facebook, Instagram, you're on these social media platforms, and that's fine. But when you start engaging in comparing yourselves to others, which is one of the most toxic things we can do, or when you start to be in a space where you're not actually connected with, again, who do I want to be? Who do I want to be in this world? It becomes very easy to say, well, this person's going on this holiday and that person's doing that. So I think this idea of recognizing the power of social contagion and recognizing the importance of knowing yourself is critical. And then another aspect, which I think gets more to the heart of Andrew's question, is it can become so easy to focus on our phones, on the texting, that we lose the meaning of our day-to-day interaction. And so you find yourself in a situation where both at work and at home, you might say to your 16-year-old son, how was your day? Without looking up from your phone. And your 16-year-old son grunts back at you, fine, without looking up from his. Now, in its moment, that might not matter. But if you think about the combination of the idea that your life is made up of these thousands of interactions or missed interactions, then you've got a very different pattern to what your ultimate life and your relationship with your son or your boss looks like. So I talk in Emotional Agility about the need for us to make habit changes that are values aligned. You know that this is precious time in your meeting with your colleagues, or you know that dinner time is the most precious time with your child. So you've already got a habit. You come home from work and you put your keys in the drawer. What I talk about in Emotional Agility is how we can create what we call piggybacking. Piggybacking is when you already have an effective habit in your life. You put your keys in the drawer. And now what you do is you piggyback by making a values-aligned alteration to that existing habit. You put your keys in the drawer and you put your phone in the drawer too. It's a values-aligned tweak that allows you to resist some of what Andrew's talking about, the impact of social.
Susan, David, Emotional
Hi,
Agility,
everyone.
We've had really good engagement, a lot of discussion.
Thank you.
I've been monitoring a lot of questions. I mean, I'm going to sort of summarize, and I'd love you to do the same. I mean, as I hear you talking about, we're all facing so much change. It's so fast. But take a moment, orient yourself. I mean, there's a lot of talk about mindfulness, but I'm reminded of that as I hear you talk, that this idea that perhaps if we stop for a minute, one, we may become more intuitive, more aware of what's happening, and really in command of how we react to the situation.
Yes.
And that's, in the end of the day, when you're talking about change, first you have to work on changing yourself. And I think that's a part of your message with Emotional Agility, is be in touch with your emotions and work on changing yourself. Is that one of the takeaways?
Well, absolutely. A core aspect of Emotional Agility is this idea that our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories are there. They are data, not directions. They're there, they're useful, but they don't need to drive you. You are more than your thoughts, your emotions, your stories. If you can connect into who you want to be in this situation, your values, you will be able to make effective transitions and deal with change effectively.
So the last question I think we didn't touch
Go for
on
it.
is, okay, we do all this, but we do work for someone who doesn't want to change, or we are part of a team that isn't able to change. What do you do?
So let me ask, I'm going to ask 3 questions, because I think this is a nice way to end. So often I'm asked these things of like, well, what if my boss really is an idiot? Or what if my boss, what if?
Yeah.
So a couple of questions. First is, are there any things in your life that you've become so focused on holding onto? I'm holding on to this idea. I'm holding on to this project. I'm holding on to this plan. I'm holding on to this hurt. Are there any things in your life that you've become so focused on holding onto, but that you actually just need to breathe into and let go of? So that's the first thing. And not all questions are going to appeal to everyone or connect with everyone. A second question is, are you so focused on being right? My boss is, my co-worker is. Are you so focused on being right that you've stopped being effective? Because being right and being effective are not the same thing. Have you become so focused on being right that you've stopped being effective? And then the third question is, are there any aspects of your life, your job, your work, your change, where you've become so stuck on the task that you haven't been able to step back and say, what is it that I'm really trying to do here? What is the long game? What is the objective? Because ultimately, if we can move into the space where, yes, the world is changing, but what is our compass? People talk about your inner core, this core that helps you like a gymnast to react effectively to the world. Your inner core is your ability to be with your emotions effectively, with courage, with curiosity, and with kindness, and to be able to know who you are and what you
I
stand
love
for in
that.
this life.
With courage, with curiosity, and with kindness.
Yeah.
And so this has been a great hour with
Thank
the doctor.
you.
We needed
Thank
to
you. The
create
doctor,
this
the
space.
doctor. I've actually
thank-
got, if anyone's interested, I've got a quiz. Do you think people
Oh,
might
would
be
be
interested
great,
in
yes.
this? So I've got an emotional agility quiz, which about 50,000 people have taken so far. It takes 5 minutes, and you get a 10-page report. If people are interested in it, it's completely free. It's at susandavid.com/learn,
So we can-
LEARN, and we'll put it in the,
So say it again.
in the title. susandavid.com/learn.
Great. Well, Susan David, thank you.
Thank
I'm
you.
inspired
Thank
and
you.
motivated.
Thank you so
lots
much
of
for
room
having
to
me.
change. Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it.
Good job on the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining
Goodbye.
Changemakers
Thank you.
Book Club.